long before European ships cast their shadows on the shores of West Africa. Slavery was already a reality on the continent. It was not the vast, transoceanic system that would later devastate millions of lives, but rather a practice woven into the fabric of tribal warfare. When one kingdom clashed with another, victory often came with human spoils. Prisoners of war could be forced into servitude, and for centuries, this was a cycle that repeated across regions. Yet, what had once been a local practice of dominance and survival would, over time, be transformed into one of the largest and most brutal economic systems in world history. This transformation began the moment European explorers arrived, hungry not only for Africa's gold and ivory but for something far more profitable: human lives. It was a shift that would reshape entire civilizations, both on the African continent and across the Atlantic. But before we explore the dark, complex history of the transatlantic slave trade, it is crucial to understand the world that existed in Africa before foreign sails appeared on the horizon. In kingdoms like Ashanti, Benin, and Dahomey, political power and wealth often came from military strength. Wars were frequent, alliances fragile, and conquest was a path to prestige. Captives taken in battle became symbols of victory, absorbed into the victor's household, fields, or armies. Unlike the racialized chattel slavery that Europeans would later impose, this earlier form of bondage carried different meanings. Some enslaved people could eventually integrate into their captor's community, and in certain cases, even rise to positions of influence. Still, life as a captive was harsh, precarious, and often stripped of freedom and dignity. Yet this system, ancient and deeply ingrained, made African societies vulnerable to the demands of outsiders. When European merchants offered firearms, luxury goods, and promises of immense wealth in exchange for slaves, many kingdoms saw an opportunity to expand their power. What had once been a practice of war became an industry of trade. Whole economies would soon shift, fueled by human suffering and exploitation on a scale the world had never witnessed before. As we move deeper into this story, we will uncover not only how the Ashanti Empire became one of the most powerful forces in this trade, but also how Europe's hunger for profit transformed West Africa forever. This is not just a tale of numbers and ships, it is a story of human lives, resilience, betrayal, and the haunting legacy that still echoes across continents today. If you find this journey into forgotten history meaningful, we invite you to support our channel. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. By doing, you help us continue to bring untold stories of the past into the light, reminding us all of the lessons history still has to teach. Together, let us keep uncovering the truths that shaped our world. As European sails appeared on the horizon and trade shifted from gold to human lives, one kingdom rose to dominate this new reality: the Ashanti Empire. Emerging in the dense forests of what is today Ghana, the Ashanti were not merely another tribal confederation but a force built on unity, military discipline, and an unyielding drive for power. Their rise was swift and formidable, transforming them from a collection of smaller Akan states into one of the most influential empires of West Africa. In this transformation lay both their strength and their eventual downfall. For the very system that elevated the Ashanti to greatness was the same that bound them to the dark machinery of the transatlantic slave trade. The Ashanti Empire's foundation was war. Their name itself, Ashanti, meant because of war, a reminder that their unity had been forged in blood. At the dawn of the 18th century, under the leadership of King Ose Tutu and the spiritual guidance of Akamfo Enoki, the Ashanti wove together rival clans into a single nation. This unity was symbolized by the legendary golden stool, which represented the soul of the people, a sacred object that no king sat upon but which embodied the collective destiny of the Ashanti. With this powerful identity and shared purpose, the empire grew stronger, expanding its borders, defeating rivals, and establishing itself as a regional superpower. Their victories in battle brought not only land but also people. Captives of war became part of Ashanti society, either absorbed into households, placed into servitude, or used as bargaining chips in negotiations. In this sense, the Ashanti were continuing a tradition that predated them, one shared across much of Africa. Yet when Europeans came offering weapons, textiles, and wealth in exchange for captives, the scale of this practice shifted dramatically. No longer were prisoners of war simply a consequence of conflict. They became the very reason for conflict. Wars were now fought not only for survival or prestige but also for profit. The Ashanti proved uniquely suited to thrive in this brutal new economy. Their military system was one of the most sophisticated in Africa at the time. They developed a structured hierarchy, clear chains of command, and disciplined regiments that allowed them to wage war effectively and repeatedly. With access to European firearms and a steady stream of goods, they expanded their reach, raiding weaker neighbors and demanding tribute in the form of captives. Treaties signed with European traders on the coast provided a constant outlet for the human lives seized inland. In this way, the Ashanti transformed themselves into the largest supplier of enslaved people in West Africa, feeding into a transatlantic system that was reshaping the entire world. Life within the Ashanti Empire reflected both complexity and contradiction. Unlike the dehumanizing racialized slavery of the Americas, the Ashanti's own domestic system allowed for certain rights and, in races, even upward mobility for captives. Some could marry into the community, gain protection under Ashanti law, or eventually integrate into society. At the same time, however, countless others were marched in chains to the coast, traded for foreign goods, and forced onto ships bound for plantations in distant lands they could never have imagined. It was this dual existence of society that could honor justice and tradition within its borders while simultaneously fueling an international trade in suffering that made the Ashanti both fascinating and deeply entangled in the story of the slave trade. The empire's political structure also set it apart. Power did not flow through a simple line of succession. Kings were elected, and their legitimacy came from the consensus of chiefs and councils. Even the most powerful rulers could be impeached if they failed to serve the interests of their people. Alongside these male-dominated structures stood the Ohenema, the Queen Mother, whose voice carried immense weight in governance, succession, and the resolution of disputes. This balance of power allowed the Ashanti to remain resilient, adaptable, and organized, making them a formidable partner and adversary for Europeans seeking to dominate the region. For European traders, the Ashanti represented both convenience and profit. Unlike other regions where foreigners had to risk venturing inland, the Ashanti delivered a steady flow of captives to the coast. A life purchased inland for a handful of goods could be sold across the Atlantic for a thousandfold profit. The Ashanti understood the value of what they offered, and for a time, they were able to negotiate from a position of strength. Their wealth grew, their cities flourished, and their armies expanded. The empire became not only a military power but also a cultural beacon, with impressive architecture, complex laws, and an identity that inspired both fear and respect. Yet this power came at a terrible price. The more the Ashanti relied on the trade in people, the more they became bound to the global system of slavery. Their economy, once built on gold and local trade, was now deeply tied to the whims of European demand. As abolition movements gained strength in the 19th century, and the international trade in slaves began to crumble, the Ashanti found themselves weakened, their source of wealth and influence slipping away. Wars with the British further destabilized the empire, and by the dawn of the 20th century, the Ashanti's proud independence had been crushed, their lands absorbed into the Gold Coast colony. The legacy of the Ashanti Empire is therefore both remarkable and tragic. They were builders of a powerful, sophisticated society, with governance, law, and culture that rivaled many nations of their time. Yet their choice to embrace and expand the trade in human lives tied their fate to a system that would ultimately bring destruction. For centuries they were the largest slave-owning and trading state in West Africa, a partner in one of the darkest chapters of history. Today, their story forces us to confront not only the cruelty of European exploitation, but also the complex realities of African participation in the trade that scattered millions across the Atlantic. The rise of the Ashanti reminds us that history is rarely simple. It is a tapestry woven with ambition, survival, resilience, and moral compromise. Their empire rose on the strength of unity and war, flourished on the profits of trade, and fell when that trade was stripped away. In remembering them, we also remember the countless lives uprooted, the cultures fractured, and the enduring scars left on two continents. When we look back at the deep roots of African societies, long before the transatlantic trade reshaped the world, we find a continent filled with migrations, kingdoms, and the rise of powerful cultures whose legacies still echo today. Among them, the Akan people stand as one of the most remarkable. Their journey tells us not only about movement and settlement, but also about how resilience, unity, and adaptation created one of the most influential empires in West African history. The Akan were not a single tribe or nation at first, but rather a collection of clans and families who began migrating southward into the region that is now Ghana sometime between the 10th and 12th centuries. They were drawn by the promise of fertile land, abundant resources, and the trade networks that linked the forests of West Africa with the great empires of the north. This was not a migration of desperation but of ambition, as communities sought better opportunities to thrive, and in doing so they laid the foundation for states that would last for centuries. As these communities settled, they organized themselves into states based on kinship, loyalty, and the control of trade. Gold became the lifeblood of the Akan people, for the region where they settled was rich in this precious resource. It was not just a symbol of wealth, but also a tool of power, attracting traders from across the Sahara and eventually from Europe, who all recognized the immense value of the Akan lands. But gold alone does not create stability or greatness. It was the Akan's ability to structure their society, to balance authority with tradition, and to create networks of allegiance that allowed them to flourish. Over time, different states emerged, each with its own ruler and identity, but all tied together by a shared heritage, language, and cultural practices. The story of the Akan is also a story of how power consolidates. For centuries, these states coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in rivalry, each trying to expand its influence. It was a dynamic period of African history, where ideas of kingship, military strength, and diplomacy intertwined. Then, in the early 18th century, something remarkable happened. The Akan states came together under a unified banner, giving birth to the Ashanti Empire. This was not simply a conquest but a unification, driven by the recognition that together they could be stronger, wealthier, and more secure. The Ashanti Empire, which rose in 1701, became one of the most formidable powers in West Africa. Lasting until 1901, the Ashanti did not build their empire on chance. They constructed it on a system that valued loyalty, military discipline, and a shared cultural identity. Their political organization was advanced, with a king, known as the Ashanti, presiding over a confederation of chiefs who represented the various states. This created a balance between central authority and local autonomy, a structure that allowed the empire to manage vast territories without collapsing under the weight of internal conflict. The golden stool, the sacred symbol of unity and authority, embodied this spirit of shared destiny. And to the Ashanti, it represented not just the throne but the soul of their people. What made the Ashanti Empire so powerful was not only its military might, although their warriors were renowned for their discipline and strategic brilliance, but also their ability to control trade routes and resources. Gold continued to flow from their lands, but so too did kola nuts and other goods that linked them to broader markets. The Ashanti built roads, established systems of taxation, and integrated conquered territories into their networks. This combination of economic strength and political organization gave them resilience against both internal strife and external threats. Yet the story of the Ashanti is also one of complexity. Their rise was tied to the larger dynamics of global trade, and their role in the shifting patterns of power in Africa during the early modern period cannot be understood in isolation. They were a people who both resisted outside domination and engaged with it when it suited their purposes, forming alliances and rivalries as the tides of history demanded. Through it all, their culture marked by vibrant art, music, festivals, and oral traditions remained a source of strength and pride. Even today, the Ashanti identity continues to be celebrated in Ghana and beyond, showing how a people who began as scattered clans could forge an enduring legacy. This journey from migration to empire connects deeply with the broader history of Africa. It reminds us that African societies were not static or isolated, but dynamic, innovative, and capable of building complex states long before European colonization reshaped the continent. The Akan migration was not just about moving from one place to another. It was about carving out a destiny, seizing opportunities, and adapting to challenges in ways that would influence generations to come. The Ashanti Empire was the culmination of this vision, a living testament to what could be achieved when people found unity in diversity and strength in shared purpose. As we move forward in this story, we see how the Ashanti and other African states navigated a world that was rapidly changing, where local power and global forces increasingly collided. Their resilience, their culture, and their ability to adapt would define not only their own fate, but also how Africa as a whole entered into a new chapter of history. This is not just a tale of the past, it is a reminder of how deeply the roots of African history run, and how those roots continue to shape the world we live in today. The very name Ashanti carries within it a story, for it translates to "because of war," a phrase that speaks volumes about the empire's origins and its character. To understand this meaning is to step into the heart of a society that defined itself by strength, unity, and conquest, where survival and growth depended upon military skill and the ability to wield power with both force and strategy. The Ashanti Empire, which rose in the dense forests of what is today Ghana, was not born by chance or gentle expansion, but out of deliberate efforts to consolidate small chiefdoms into one formidable force. These chiefdoms, often competing with one another for control of resources, realized that unity under a single ruler could transform them into something far greater. It was in this crucible of conflict and necessity that the Asante identity was forged, with war not only as a means of defense, but as the very foundation upon which the empire rested. From the very beginning, warfare was not random destruction, but a carefully orchestrated process of expansion. Victories brought more than territory. They brought prestige, wealth, and the ability to control trade routes that linked the interior of West Africa to the coastal markets where European merchants waited. The Asante people, with their well-trained armies and brilliant military leaders, recognized that the path to survival in a competitive region was paved with conquest. Each campaign further cemented the name Asante, for it was because of war that they had become strong, and it was through war that they continued to thrive. The Ashanti armies became legendary, organized under a centralized system that enabled swift mobilization of thousands of men, each committed to the Asante, the king who embodied both political and spiritual authority. Their use of iron weaponry, tactical formations, and psychological warfare set them apart from neighboring societies, while their fierce loyalty to the golden stool, the sacred symbol of the nation, unified them with a spiritual bond that went beyond ordinary allegiance. To fight for Ashanti was not merely to engage in battle, it was to defend the very soul of the empire, to ensure that the legacy of their ancestors and the blessings of their gods endured. Yet, the meaning of because of war also reflects a paradox. For while it brought glory and expansion, it also tied the empire inexorably to the cycle of conflict. Wars of conquest provided captives who became a vital part of the empire's economic system. These captives were integrated into Ashanti society in multiple ways. Some absorbed into households and communities. Others sent down the trade routes that connected to European merchants on the coast. Thus, war was not only a political necessity but also an economic engine, feeding the empire's wealth and allowing it to dominate regional trade. In this way, the Ashanti understanding of war extended beyond the battlefield. It was also about sustaining power, influence, and prosperity in a world where strength defined survival. The empire's reliance on warfare also created a cultural identity that celebrated bravery, loyalty, and martial skill. Songs, proverbs, and ceremonies exalted the warrior's path, ensuring that each generation understood its duty to defend and expand the realm. War was woven into the rhythms of life, with military campaigns marked by rituals to the gods and celebrations that honored the sacrifices of those who fought. The Ashanti did not view conflict as an unfortunate necessity but as a sacred obligation, one that gave meaning to their existence and bound them together as a people. To say Ashanti was to acknowledge this truth. Their unity and power existed because of war, and without it, they would be no more than scattered chiefdoms vulnerable to their rivals. At the same time, their martial foundation gave the Ashanti Empire the strength to resist external threats, including encroaching European powers who sought to impose their will upon the region. While many West African societies fell swiftly under colonial influence, the Ashanti resisted fiercely, engaging in multiple wars against the British throughout the 19th century. Each clash was another chapter in the ongoing story of a people defined by war, unwilling to surrender the sovereignty that their ancestors had won through blood and determination. Even in defeat, the Ashanti spirit endured, their cultural pride unbroken, for they saw themselves as heirs to a warrior tradition that no foreign power could erase. This dual legacy of war, glory and tragedy, unity and dependence makes the story of the Ashanti Empire profoundly complex. The phrase "because of war" reminds us that while it was conflict that built their empire, it was also conflict that shaped their society in ways that could not easily be undone. War was the foundation of their identity, the source of their prosperity, and the measure of their strength, but it also bound them to the cycles of violence and dependency that came with it. Their story, then, is not merely about conquest or dominance, but about the choices a society makes when survival depends upon the mastery of war. To walk through the history of the Ashanti Empire is to see the many layers of meaning behind their name. It is to witness how conflict, while destructive, can also forge bonds of unity and create legacies that endure across centuries. It is to understand that the Ashanti people, in naming themselves because of war, were not simply glorifying violence but recognizing the central truth of their existence, that their nation had been built, defended, and sustained through the strength of their warriors and the sacrifices of their people. And though the world around them has changed, that legacy remains a defining part of West African history, a reminder of the power of unity, the cost of conflict, and the enduring spirit of a people who understood that their very name carried within it the story of their rise. When the Portuguese first set sail along the unfamiliar coastlines of West Africa in 1415, their motivations were not initially shaped by thoughts of human exploitation but by the age-old hunger for wealth, particularly the glitter of gold that had long fueled European ambition. The Kingdom of Mali had already made the region famous across Europe and the Middle East for its staggering reserves of this precious metal, and stories of riches beyond measure stirred the imaginations of men in Lisbon, just as tales of El Dorado would later inspire Spaniards across the Atlantic. For the Portuguese crown, still riding the momentum of the Reconquista and eager to establish its place as a maritime power. West Africa represented both a test of its nautical prowess and a potential gateway to fortune. Thus, caravels began hugging the shoreline, mapping estuaries, trading with local chiefs, and establishing fortified outposts to secure their hold. At first, the exchanges between Europeans and Africans were uneven but not yet catastrophic. Gold dust and ivory, products long linked to local trade networks, flowed toward Europe, while copper, cloth, beads, and eventually firearms came in the opposite direction. Yet the true transformation of this contact would come not from these commodities but from something far darker. As European appetites for cheap labor grew with the planting of sugar in Madeira, São Tomé, and later the Caribbean, the Portuguese and those who followed them looked upon the peoples of Africa not only as trading partners, but as a source of human labor for an expanding economic system that stretched across oceans. What began with tentative exchanges soon hardened into a relentless cycle in which men, women, and children became commodities within a global trade network. The shift was gradual yet undeniable. Portuguese ships that once sailed upriver in search of gold began to transport captives from coastal enclaves to newly established plantations. The sugar mills of the Atlantic islands demanded workers who could endure grueling conditions. And in the logic of profit, human lives were redefined as labor units. By the late 15th century, thousands were being carried away each year, their lives uprooted, their identities torn apart, their stories often lost to history except for the silent testimony of numbers recorded in cargo manifests. For the Portuguese crown, this trade was lucrative beyond measure, funding explorations further afield and strengthening its influence among competing European powers. But the Portuguese were not alone for long. Their initial monopoly over these routes and their fortified trading posts did not go uncontested. As word spread of the wealth that could be extracted from Africa's coasts not only in gold but in the expanding commerce of people, other European states grew restless. The Spanish, benefiting from their proximity and their rivalry with Portugal, soon gained the right to participate through agreements sanctioned by the Pope, and with the discovery of the Americas they sought workers to replace the native populations devastated by disease. The English and the French, watching enviously from across the Channel, began to send their own expeditions southward. By the 17th century, the Dutch too would establish themselves, driven by the same relentless logic of mercantilism and imperial ambition. The arrival of each new power intensified competition and violence along Africa's shores. Fortresses were built and rebuilt, seized and reclaimed, their cannons pointing both outward to protect against rival Europeans and inward to coerce local rulers. African societies, which had for centuries engaged in warfare and slave raiding within their own contexts, found themselves enmeshed in a system far larger and more devastating than anything that had existed before. Chiefs and kings who once traded gold or ivory were now pressed into supplying captives, sometimes from rival ethnic groups, sometimes from within their own communities. The balance of power shifted as firearms induced by Europeans altered the dynamics of conflict, enabling some kingdoms to expand while others collapsed under the strain. This was not a simple story of Europeans imposing from without and Africans passively accepting from within. It was a tangled web of alliances, betrayals, opportunism, and resistance. African leaders navigated the pressures with varying degrees of agency, some seeking to profit, others attempting to shield their people, and many caught between forces too great to resist. Yet over time the cumulative impact was devastating. What had begun with the Portuguese quest for gold in 1415 became, within a few generations, a system that reshaped entire continents. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled European economies, underwriting wars, financing monarchies, and accelerating the rise of capitalism, while the human cost was borne by millions who endured forced removal. brutal conditions, and the destruction of ancestral ties. The Portuguese had set the precedent, but the system that followed was multinational, relentless, and tragically enduring. The forts they built, the treaties they signed, the rivalries they ignited all served to embed Africa into a global network that transformed oceans into highways of commerce. From Lisbon to Seville, from London to Amsterdam, and eventually across the Atlantic to the plantations of Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, the consequences of those early voyages multiplied. By the 18th century, the trade in human beings had become one of the central engines of global wealth, and the European powers who once followed Portugal's lead were now competing with it on equal footing or surpassing it in scale. Thus, the Portuguese arrival in 1415, motivated first by the search for gold, marks a fateful turning point in world history. What might have remained a story of exploration and trade became, instead, the opening chapter of centuries of forced migration and suffering on an unprecedented scale. And as other European nations joined the pursuit, drawn by both the glitter of gold and the grim profit of human bondage, Africa's coasts were transformed into contested frontiers, forever altering the destinies of continents and peoples. As the centuries unfolded, the human toll of the transatlantic trade became staggering, marking one of the darkest chapters in global history. Over a span of roughly 300 years, it is estimated that about 13 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean, a figure that conveys the sheer scale of the operation yet barely hints at the individual human tragedies behind the numbers. Each person represented a story cut short or violently redirected, families torn apart, cultures disrupted, and lives uprooted in ways that would echo for generations. The majority of these captives, nearly 90%, were claimed by Spain and Portugal, whose early and persistent involvement in the trade solidified their dominance in the exploitation of African labor. The journey itself was horrific. Captives were crammed into the holds of ships with little regard for health, sanitation, or basic dignity. The Middle Passage, as this leg of the triangular trade became known, was a grueling voyage that could last weeks or even months. Diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and measles spread rapidly, and malnutrition was rampant. Many perished before they even reached the plantations that awaited them, their bodies consigned to the sea, leaving behind a silence that no record could fully capture. Those who survived were then thrust into a life of relentless labor, cultivated under brutal conditions designed to maximize profit at the expense of human life. From the sugar fields of Brazil to the tobacco and cotton plantations of the Caribbean and North America, enslaved Africans were made to endure backbreaking work, facing punishment, deprivation, and the constant threat of violence. The involvement of Spain and Portugal in this massive enterprise was both strategic and systematic. Portugal, having begun the process with their early forays along the West African coast, leveraged their established networks and forts to secure a steady supply of enslaved individuals. Spain, with the conquest of the Americas, found a vast demand for labor in territories where indigenous populations had been decimated by disease and warfare. Together, these nations shaped the transatlantic system into an industrial-scale operation, backed by maritime expertise, capital, and state sanction. Their ships carried goods to Africa in exchange for human lives, and then transported the enslaved across the ocean, only to return to Europe laden with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities produced through this forced labor. The triangular trade became a continuous cycle, linking continents in a network of commerce whose prosperity was inseparable from suffering. Yet within these numbers and transactions lies a complex story of resilience and adaptation. Enslaved Africans brought with them knowledge, traditions, and skills that profoundly shaped the societies in which they were forced to live. Agricultural techniques. culinary practices, music, and spiritual beliefs were carried across the ocean, often blending with European and indigenous traditions to create new cultural forms. In the Caribbean, the Americas, and Brazil, these contributions became cornerstones of local identities, even as the people who created them lived under unimaginable oppression. The legacy of these Africans is a testimony to endurance, creativity, and the capacity to maintain humanity under conditions designed to strip it away. The systems of trade and exploitation did not operate in isolation. They were intricately tied to political and economic strategies on both sides of the Atlantic. European nations, driven by mercantilist ambitions, competed fiercely for control of ports, trade routes, and alliances with African rulers who could provide captives. In Africa, kingdoms like the Ashanti leveraged their military prowess and strategic position to negotiate, enforce, or resist the capture and sale of their people and neighboring populations, intertwining local and global interests in ways that were often morally complex and historically consequential. Every treaty, alliance, or conflict carried implications for who would live, who would die, and who would be sent across the ocean, illustrating that the transatlantic trade was not simply a European imposition, but a deeply interconnected system shaped by multiple actors, each navigating power, survival, and profit. The magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade also reshaped societies in the Americas and the Caribbean. Entire economies were built upon the forced labor of enslaved Africans, from sugar plantations in the Caribbean to coffee estates in Brazil, from rice paddies in the Carolinas to cotton fields along the Mississippi. The labor provided by these individuals created immense wealth for European investors, plantation owners, and colonial administrations, and yet it was wealth that depended entirely on coercion and brutality. The social and demographic transformations were profound. African populations became central to the cultural, economic, and political landscapes of the New World, even as their autonomy and freedom were violently suppressed. Even in the face of this brutality, resistance and agency persisted. Enslaved Africans organized rebellions, escaped to form maroon communities, preserved cultural practices, and fought in subtle and overt ways to reclaim control over their lives. These acts of resistance were a constant reminder that the trade, while extensive and devastating, was never uncontested. Every escape, every revolt, and every preservation of language or tradition was a challenge to a system designed to erase identity and enforce submission, highlighting the resilience and courage of those subjected to unimaginable suffering. Understanding the figure of 13 million transported Africans forces us to confront both the scale and the depth of the tragedy. It is not merely a statistic. It is a representation of human lives, communities, and futures forever altered. It is also a lens through which we can see the interconnections between continents, economies, and cultures that defined an era. Spain and Portugal's near monopoly over this trade underscores how state power, commerce, and ambition converged to create one of history's most extensive systems of human exploitation. Yet, woven into this dark history are threads of endurance, adaptation, and cultural survival, reminding us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, humanity and agency persisted. By tracing these journeys, acknowledging the suffering, and honoring the resilience of those who endured them, we gain not only historical understanding, but also a deeper appreciation for the profound ways in which the transatlantic slave trade shaped our world. It is a story of loss, yes, but also a story of survival, culture, and the enduring spirit of millions whose lives were forever marked by the tides of history. The Ashanti Empire was remarkable not only for its military might and expansive reach, but also for the sophistication of its political and social structures, which set it apart from many contemporary states in both Africa and Europe. At the heart of this system was a commitment to meritocracy, a principle that resonated deeply in a society built on both discipline and accountability. Unlike kingdoms where power passed automatically from parent to child, in Ashanti culture, kings were chosen based on competence, leadership, and the respect they commanded from their peers and subjects. This meant that each Ashanti, or king, was elected by a council of chiefs who themselves were selected for their abilities, ensuring that the leadership of the empire was rooted not in mere heredity, but in demonstrated skill and wisdom. This system created a dynamic form of governance where the ruler was accountable, and even the highest authority could be challenged or removed if he failed in his duties, illustrating a principle that resonates with modern notions of checks and balances. The councils, often likened to parliaments, played a central role in shaping the empire's policies, negotiating treaties, and guiding military campaigns. Their influence extended to all critical decisions, from economic arrangements to territorial expansion, creating a complex yet coherent system where power was distributed and deliberated rather than concentrated unchecked in the hands of a single individual. The king could propose or object, but decisions required collective approval, which introduced a level of stability and rational governance rare in the era. This consultative approach allowed the Ashanti Empire to navigate both internal conflicts and external pressures with strategic foresight, ensuring that decisions were informed by a broad spectrum of voices and expertise rather than the whims of a solitary ruler. Equally remarkable was the status and influence of women within Ashanti society, epitomized by the Unama, the Queen Mother. Far from being a ceremonial figure, she wielded genuine authority, advising on the selection of chiefs and even kings, mediating disputes, and shaping policies that affected the entire empire. Her involvement in political, judicial, and social matters ensured that women's perspectives were integral to governance, a striking contrast to many societies of the same period, where women's roles were severely restricted. The Onama's participation was not symbolic but practical. She could appoint leaders, intervene in succession disputes, and influence the distribution of land and resources, demonstrating that power in the Ashanti Empire was not solely masculine but shared and negotiated across genders. The legal system further reflected the sophistication of Ashanti governance, with laws that emphasized intent, justice, and proportionality. A murder, for instance, required proof of intent before the harshest penalties could be applied, and accidental deaths were treated with compensation rather than execution. Even individuals traditionally considered incapable of judgment, such as the insane, were only held responsible under specific circumstances, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of responsibility and fairness. Slaves within the empire, though still bound in status, retained certain rights, including the ability to marry free individuals and to be treated justly within households, reflecting a legal framework that balanced hierarchy with humanity. Decision-making within the empire extended beyond the formal councils to a network of consultations and negotiations that involved various stakeholders, from tribal elders to military commanders and religious advisors. The Ashanti understood that the strength of their empire depended on the legitimacy of their governance, which could only be secured through dialogue, consensus, and accountability. Treaties, particularly those with European powers, were never the sole prerogative of the king. They required careful deliberation by the councils and were often ratified with input from the Onama and other influential figures. This system ensured that agreements were broadly supported and that the empire could present a united front in dealings with both neighboring states and foreign traders. The merit-based system also fostered innovation and adaptability. Kings who demonstrated skill could rise, while those who failed were subject to impeachment, creating incentives for effective leadership and accountability. During periods of expansion or crisis, this flexible structure allowed the Ashanti to mobilize resources efficiently, maintain internal cohesion, and respond strategically to threats both within and beyond their borders. Military campaigns. Economic initiatives and diplomatic efforts were all planned with the input of knowledgeable advisors, ensuring that the empire could sustain its power over centuries despite the pressures of internal dissent and European encroachment. What emerges from the Ashanti system is a portrait of governance that was both sophisticated and deeply human. It balanced authority with accountability, centralized power with consultative processes, and incorporated voices often excluded in other societies, particularly those of women. The Onomas influence, alongside the deliberations of councils and the meritocratic selection of kings, created a society that valued competence, fairness, and strategic foresight. This structure allowed the Ashanti Empire not only to survive but to flourish amid the turbulent economic and political landscape of West Africa, establishing itself as a dominant force that was respected, feared, and studied by contemporaries and later historians alike. In essence, the Ashanti Empire's political system was a testament to the possibility of governance grounded in merit, consultation, and inclusivity. By blending strong leadership with accountability and incorporating the perspectives of both men and women, the empire created a resilient and adaptable society. It is a reminder that power does not have to be absolute to be effective, and that respect for expertise, dialogue, and fairness can form the foundation of enduring institutions. In studying the Ashanti, we glimpse the remarkable achievements of a society that harmonized strength with wisdom, conquest with governance, and tradition with innovation, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire understanding of leadership, law, and social organization today. The legal system of the Ashanti Empire was as intricate and thoughtful as its political institutions, reflecting a culture that prized order, fairness, and social cohesion even amid the complexities of empire building and warfare. Unlike many contemporaneous societies where the law could be arbitrary and harsh, the Ashanti system emphasized intent, recognizing that the circumstances surrounding a crime were as important as the act itself. Murder, for example, was judged not only by the outcome but by whether the perpetrator intended harm. Accidental deaths were treated with restitution to the family of the deceased rather than capital punishment, a distinction that demonstrated a deep understanding of justice and proportionality. Even actions that might otherwise have been punished severely, such as acts by those considered mentally unstable, were evaluated carefully, with responsibility assigned only under specific conditions. This nuanced approach to accountability created a sense of fairness and predictability in society, which in turn reinforced the legitimacy of Ashanti governance and the trust of its citizens. Slavery, though an integral part of the Ashanti economy and social order, was not devoid of legal recognition or protections for those enslaved. Domestic slaves, for instance, retained certain rights that distinguished them from the chattel slavery later institutionalized in the Americas. They could intermarry with free individuals, a practice that allowed some blending of social strata and preserved family ties even within constrained circumstances. The rights afforded to slaves also extended to fair treatment under the law, meaning that mistreatment by masters could be addressed through the judicial system, and there were established penalties for those who violated these protections. While these legal provisions did not erase the inherent injustice of slavery, they reflect a society that acknowledged the humanity of all its members and sought to regulate power and responsibility in ways that mitigated potential abuses. The Ashanti legal framework extended beyond individual conduct to encompass societal norms, economic arrangements, and political obligations. Property rights, commercial contracts, and inheritance practices were codified and enforced in ways that maintained stability within a complex and hierarchical society. Treaties, both internal and with foreign powers, were scrutinized by councils and subject to legal validation, ensuring that agreements carried the weight of law rather than mere expedience. This attention to procedural integrity contributed to the empire's ability to navigate both local conflicts and the pressures imposed by European traders, allowing Ashanti leaders to operate strategically within a web of competing interests and obligations. In addition, the legal system underscored the role of women and community leaders in maintaining social order. The Ohenema, or Queen Mother, was a key participant not only in political decision-making but also in adjudicating disputes, particularly those involving women and family matters. Her influence in legal matters complemented the broader judicial system, providing balance and ensuring that a diversity of perspectives informed rulings. By incorporating voices beyond the male-dominated councils, the Ashanti created a more holistic and socially responsive approach to law, one that considered both individual rights and communal responsibilities. The interplay between law, governance, and society in the Ashanti Empire can also be seen in the way military campaigns and territorial expansion were regulated. While conquest and the capture of slaves were central to the empire's economic model, these actions were bound by legal norms that dictated treatment of captives and the distribution of resources. Councils debated military strategies, approved treaties, and adjudicated disputes arising from warfare, demonstrating that the pursuit of power was guided by codified principles rather than unrestrained force. Even within this context of conquest, the legal framework sought to temper the extremes of human behavior and to embed accountability into decisions with far-reaching consequences. The ability of the Ashanti legal system to accommodate complexity and nuance contributed significantly to the resilience of the empire. By establishing rules that balanced authority with rights, intent with consequence, and hierarchy with social responsibility, the Ashanti maintained cohesion across diverse populations and expansive territories. This system enabled them to negotiate with European powers, manage internal rivalries, and sustain a stable society capable of enduring the pressures of a rapidly changing world. Legal structures were not abstract ideals but practical tools for maintaining order, fostering trust, and ensuring the empire could function effectively in both domestic and international arenas. Moreover, the Ashanti approach to law and justice highlights the integration of ethics and pragmatism. It was a system that acknowledged human imperfection, that distinguished between deliberate wrongdoing and misfortune, and that recognized the importance of fairness in sustaining social bonds. By allowing for intermarriage between slaves and free people, by protecting the rights of vulnerable populations, and by involving women in critical judicial roles, the Ashanti demonstrated a commitment to a society where power was accountable and governance was tempered by consideration of justice and community welfare. This legal sophistication was mirrored in the empire as broader cultural and administrative achievements, including its meritocratic selection of leaders, consultative councils, and effective military organization. Together, these institutions created a society capable of remarkable accomplishments while navigating the moral and practical challenges of empire, trade, and war. The Ashanti legal system, therefore, is not only a historical curiosity but also a profound example of how governance, law, and society can intertwine to produce resilience, equity, and strategic coherence, even in the face of profound human and political pressures. In reflecting upon the Ashanti legal system, we see a civilization that combined pragmatism with principle, flexibility with structure, and authority with accountability. Its laws governed not only the actions of the powerful, but also protected the rights and dignity of those most vulnerable, creating a framework that allowed the empire to thrive while embedding a sense of justice and ethical responsibility into the fabric of daily life. This legal tradition stands as a testament to the capacity of societies to craft governance systems that are both effective and humane, leaving a legacy that continues to inform our understanding of law, justice, and social organization today. The establishment of the Royal African Company in 1660 marked a pivotal moment in the history of the transatlantic slave trade, intertwining European ambition, African enterprise, and human tragedy into a system of global commerce whose consequences would echo for centuries. Founded by a coalition of English elites, including the Duke of York, who later became King James I, and prominent figures like Edward Colston, the company was conceived with a singular purpose: to dominate the trade of enslaved Africans to the New World while securing access to gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities along the West African coast. This corporate venture was not merely a commercial endeavor. It was a state-backed instrument of power that combined the financial clout of aristocrats with the logistical expertise of seasoned merchants and navigators, creating an organization capable of coordinating thousands of voyages across treacherous waters and overseeing the systematic enslavement of human beings on an unprecedented scale. From the outset, the Royal African Company leveraged England's growing maritime capabilities, using ships that sailed from ports like Bristol, London, and Liverpool to establish forts, trade posts, and alliances along the West African coast. These outposts functioned as hubs for commerce, negotiation, and, tragically, human procurement, where captives acquired from local conflicts or raids were exchanged for European goods such as firearms, textiles, and manufactured items. The company's structure allowed it to operate efficiently and at scale, effectively consolidating control over the capture, transport, and sale of enslaved Africans, and in doing so it transformed the movement of human lives into a highly organized, industrial-scale operation. The combination of European demand for labor in the Americas and the company's systematic approach created a cycle of extraction and profit that would sustain itself for decades, ultimately making it the largest single transporter of enslaved Africans to the Americas during its peak. The human cost of this enterprise was staggering. Each voyage carried hundreds of captives, crammed into the lower decks of ships under conditions designed for maximum capacity rather than human dignity or health. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse were rampant, and mortality rates during the Middle Passage were tragically high, with tens of thousands of individuals perishing before reaching the plantations of the Caribbean, North America, and South America. For those who survived, the arrival in foreign lands meant a life of relentless labor and subjugation. Yet it also carried the potential for cultural adaptation and resilience, even within the brutal confines of enslavement. African traditions, languages, and religious practices endured, blending with European and indigenous customs to form the rich and complex societies of the New World. The company's dominance in the slave trade also reflected the intersection of political power and commerce. As a state-sanctioned enterprise, the Royal African Company enjoyed privileges and protections that allowed it to negotiate treaties with African rulers, enforce trading monopolies, and secure its operations against competitors. The company's leadership, including members of the English monarchy and Parliament, treated the business as both an investment and an instrument of national influence, demonstrating how economic ambition, political authority, and human exploitation were intertwined. In many, the Royal African Company exemplified the broader patterns of European colonial expansion, where the extraction of resources, human and material, was structured through legal, political, and corporate mechanisms that normalized and facilitated extraordinary suffering. The interactions with African states were complex and often morally ambiguous. Kingdoms like the Ashanti negotiated, resisted, or participated in the trade based on their strategic interests, balancing internal power dynamics, territorial ambitions, and the desire for wealth. Treaties and alliances with the Royal African Company provided these kingdoms with goods, military support, or political leverage, Yet they also embedded African leaders in a system that commodified human life on a scale never seen before. This entanglement illustrates the dual nature of the transatlantic trade. While European institutions provided the framework for large-scale transport, African polities were not mere passive victims but active participants in a network shaped by economics, warfare, and diplomacy, even as the system ultimately imposed immense suffering on countless individuals. The Royal African Company's operations were meticulously organized. Captives were branded with the company's initials or symbols to mark ownership, and records were kept detailing voyages, cargoes, and profits. This bureaucratic approach to human trafficking was unprecedented, treating enslaved individuals as commodities in ledgers rather than human beings with families, cultures, and aspirations. The scale of this enterprise was immense. Over decades, hundreds of thousands of Africans were transported across the Atlantic under the company's authority, and while mortality rates were high, the profits generated fueled England's commercial growth and colonial expansion, linking the fortunes of a nation to the suffering of millions. Despite its early successes, the company eventually faced financial difficulties, mismanagement, and political challenges, particularly as competing interests emerged and as the ethical and practical pressures of abolitionist movements began to mount. Yet its legacy endured, both in the Americas, where the social and economic structures built on enslaved labor persisted for generations, and in Africa, where the demographic, cultural, and political consequences of the trade reshaped societies in profound ways. The Royal African Company stands as a stark reminder of how ambition, commerce, and state power can intersect to create systems of extraordinary human impact, for better or worse, and it underscores the importance of historical reflection in understanding the forces that have shaped the modern world. By examining the Royal African Company, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade but also into the broader structures of empire, commerce, and human resilience. The stories of those transported, the policies of the company, and the interactions with African kingdoms collectively reveal a complex tapestry of ambition, exploitation, and survival. While the scale and brutality of the trade are deeply sobering, the endurance and cultural legacy of the African peoples who survived it continue to inform our understanding of history, identity, and the capacity for human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. This narrative reminds us that history is never solely about institutions and statistics, but about the lived experiences of individuals and communities, whose lives and legacies continue to resonate across centuries. The reign of Ose Tutu I marked a defining era for the Ashanti Empire, a period in which vision, strategy, and ambition coalesced to transform a collection of fragmented Akan states into one of the most powerful and formidable kingdoms in West Africa. Ose Tutu, a leader of remarkable intellect and charisma, recognized that the survival and prosperity of his people required not only internal unity, but also a sophisticated approach to military organization, political governance, and international trade. Central to his strategy was the creation of a highly disciplined, well-structured military capable of projecting power both defensively and offensively, ensuring that the Ashanti could protect their lands while also extending influence over neighboring territories. This military, carefully organized with ranks, command structures, and innovative tactics, became the backbone of the empire's expansion, allowing Ose Tutu to enforce authority, secure trade routes, and negotiate from a position of strength with external powers, including the European traders along the coast and the Muslim intermediaries further inland. Under Ose Tutu's guidance, the Ashanti military was not merely a tool of conquest but a mechanism for state building, integrating newly acquired territories and incorporating them into the empire's administrative and economic frameworks. Conquests were meticulously planned, and victories were leveraged to expand the empire's access to resources, labor, and trade networks. The capture of slaves through warfare and alliances became a central pillar of the Ashanti economy, enabling the kingdom to meet the growing demands of European merchants, while also consolidating power over neighboring states. This dual focus on military strength and economic leverage allowed the Ashanti to negotiate treaties on favorable terms, maintain relative stability within a turbulent regional landscape, and participate as influential actors in the transatlantic trade without sacrificing their sovereignty or cultural identity. Osei Tutu's military strategy was inseparable from his vision for political cohesion. Recognizing the importance of legitimacy and collective governance, he intertwined military command with the empire's council-based system, ensuring that decisions regarding campaigns, territorial expansion, and alliances were deliberated carefully with chiefs, elders, and advisors. The collaboration between military leadership and political councils created a synergy that enhanced both strategic planning and the empire's internal cohesion, making it resilient to internal dissent and external threats alike. The army was disciplined not only in warfare but also in its integration with civil administration, demonstrating that the Ashanti approach to power was comprehensive and sophisticated, combining strength with foresight and ambition with prudence. Internationally, Osei Tutu understood the complex dynamics of trade and diplomacy. The Ashanti engaged with European powers, such as the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and later the French, to secure favorable trading terms, while also maintaining connections with Muslim merchants who had long-standing trade networks in West Africa. These relationships were not passive but negotiated carefully, leveraging the empire's military and economic strength to ensure that interactions were mutually beneficial, or at least advantageous to Ashanti interests. The kingdom's capacity to supply enslaved labor, gold, and other commodities in large quantities made it a central player in the transatlantic economy. And Osei Tutu's leadership ensured that these resources were mobilized efficiently, providing wealth and stability that reinforced the empire's position in the region. The Ashanti approach to slavery under Osei Tutu's rule was tightly linked to both military conquest and economic strategy. Captives taken in war were integrated into the empire's labor system, often used in agriculture, crafts, or as part of the social and political hierarchy of subordinate territories. The careful regulation of slavery within the empire, including provisions for domestic slaves and their rights, created a structured system that maximized the economic benefits of conquest while mitigating internal tensions. This disciplined approach allowed the Ashanti to sustain long-term campaigns, maintain territorial control, and participate effectively in trade networks that stretched from the African interior to the ports of the Atlantic coast. Culturally, Osei Tutu's reign reinforced the symbolic and spiritual dimensions of Ashanti authority, uniting the empire under shared rituals, symbols, and institutions. The golden stool, believed to embody the soul of the Ashanti nation, became a unifying emblem, legitimizing the king's authority while anchoring loyalty and cohesion across diverse communities. Military success, economic prosperity, and spiritual legitimacy were interwoven, demonstrating that Ashanti power was multidimensional, rooted not only in force but also in culture, governance, and shared identity. This combination of practical and symbolic authority allowed the Ashanti to command respect from both local populations and foreign powers, strengthening the empire's position in an increasingly interconnected world. Osei Tutu's integration of military prowess, administrative sophistication, and strategic diplomacy created an empire that could expand rapidly while maintaining internal stability. Every campaign was measured not just by territorial gain but by its contribution to the empire's social, economic, and political coherence. Captured territories were incorporated thoughtfully. Councils and leaders were engaged in governance, and trade was leveraged to enhance wealth and influence, ensuring that the Ashanti Empire under Ozi Chuchu was not merely a conquering force, but a highly organized, resilient, and adaptive state capable of navigating the shifting tides of regional and global dynamics. The legacy of Ozi Chuchu is thus inseparable from the empire he shaped, by building a disciplined military, fostering strategic alliances, and integrating the management of human, economic, and political resources. He created a foundation that allowed the Ashanti to dominate West Africa for generations. His leadership exemplifies how vision, organization, and strategic thinking can transform fragmented societies into enduring powers, and it offers lessons in the interplay between military strength, governance, and economic acumen. Through his reign, we see the Ashanti Empire not only as a central participant in the transatlantic trade, but as a society capable of remarkable innovation, resilience, and influence, leaving a legacy that continues to illuminate the complexities of African history and the global forces that shaped it. In studying Ozi Chuchu and the Ashanti military expansion, we gain insight into the delicate balance between ambition and governance, force and diplomacy, and survival and strategy, reminding us that the history of empires is as much about human ingenuity and leadership as it is about conquest and commerce, and that even within systems marked by profound ethical challenges, remarkable organizational achievements and strategic brilliance can emerge. The decline of the Ashanti Empire is a story of shifting global dynamics, internal adaptation, and the harsh consequences of an increasingly interconnected world. For centuries, the Ashanti had leveraged their military strength, political cohesion, and strategic trade relationships to build one of the most formidable powers in West Africa. The empire's wealth and influence were closely tied to its participation in the transatlantic trade, particularly the provision of enslaved labor to European markets, which not only generated immense profits, but also secured the loyalty of neighboring states through treaties, tribute, and military alliances. However, as the 19th century progressed, international pressures began to reshape the landscape of commerce and diplomacy, with European powers, most notably Britain, increasingly committed to ending the slave trade, a moral and political campaign that would have profound repercussions for the Ashanti state. The British, motivated by both ethical and economic considerations, gradually imposed restrictions and treaties to halt the export of enslaved Africans, effectively cutting off one of the Ashanti Empire's primary sources of wealth and influence. The empire, which had built much of its social and political infrastructure around the capture, management, and trade of slaves, faced a sudden and destabilizing challenge. The abolition of the slave trade undermined the economic foundation that had supported its armies, funded its governance, and enabled its diplomatic leverage over neighboring kingdoms. While the Ashanti had previously thrived on the strategic use of force and negotiation, the withdrawal of European demand exposed vulnerabilities in the empire's reliance on external markets for sustenance and power. In response to these changes, the Ashanti attempted to adapt. Though their options were limited, the empire sought alternative sources of revenue and new avenues for maintaining authority, including continued military campaigns to assert dominance over local rivals and attempts to engage with European powers on other terms. Yet the combination of lost trade income, mounting European influence along the coast, and internal pressures strained the empire's capacity to maintain cohesion. Leadership within the Ashanti faced difficult decisions, balancing the need to protect traditional sources of power with the realities of a world increasingly dominated by foreign empires whose economic and military resources far exceeded their own. The tensions generated by these challenges set the stage for repeated confrontations with Britain, as the Ashanti resisted attempts to curtail their sovereignty and sought to preserve both territory and autonomy. The Anglo-Ashanti conflicts that followed were brutal and protracted, spanning several decades and testing the resilience of both sides. The British, equipped with superior weaponry and leveraging strategic alliances with coastal peoples, pressed inland to enforce their trade embargoes and extend colonial control, while the Ashanti mounted determined resistance, drawing upon their well-organized armies, deep knowledge of the terrain, and a history of successful campaigns. Each encounter was not merely a military engagement, but also a contest of strategy, diplomacy, and endurance, reflecting the Ashanti's capacity for adaptation even in the face of a dramatically altered geopolitical environment. The empire's leaders endeavored to negotiate when possible, but repeated clashes were inevitable as Britain sought to consolidate its influence, and the Ashanti sought to defend their autonomy. The cumulative effect of these conflicts, however, was ultimately the erosion of Ashanti power. Despite their historical reputation for military innovation and political acumen, the empire could not withstand the combined pressures of international abolitionist efforts, sustained British military campaigns, and the disruption of its traditional economic systems. The fall of key territories and the loss of trade revenues diminished the empire's ability to field armies and maintain alliances, gradually undermining the cohesion that had enabled the Ashanti to thrive for centuries. The capture and occupation of strategic towns, the destruction of infrastructure, and the imposition of treaties increasingly constrained Ashanti autonomy, signaling the inexorable expansion of British colonial authority in the region. By 1902, after decades of conflict and negotiation, the Ashanti Empire was formally absorbed into the Gold Coast colony under British rule, marking the end of an era of independence and regional supremacy. The once mighty kingdom, renowned for its disciplined military, sophisticated governance, and extensive trade networks, had succumbed to the structural and strategic pressures imposed by a global movement against slavery and the relentless advance of European colonial ambitions. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of the Ashanti persisted. Their political structures, cultural symbols, and historical memory continued to influence the social and political fabric of what would eventually become the nation of Ghana, which achieved independence in 1957. The absorption of the Ashanti into the Gold Coast colony illustrates a broader historical pattern in which empires and states dependent on specific economic systems must adapt to external forces or face decline. The Ashanti's experience underscores how interconnected the world had become by the 19th century, where European policy shifts, moral campaigns, and global trade dynamics could dramatically alter the fate of powerful local empires thousands of miles away. Their story is a testament to resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges, highlighting the complex interplay between agency and external pressures, as well as the enduring importance of governance, military strategy, and cultural cohesion even when traditional sources of power are eroded. Studying the decline of the Ashanti Empire also offers insight into the human and social dimensions of historical change. The upheaval brought about by abolition, war, and colonial integration affected not only political leaders but also ordinary citizens, communities, and families, whose lives were reshaped by shifting borders, economic disruption, and the imposition of foreign rule. The Ashanti's response: resistance, adaptation, negotiation, and survival reflects both the limitations and the capacities of human societies to navigate change. Through these events, we can trace the threads of continuity and transformation that define West African history, recognizing how empires like the Ashanti navigated the tension between traditional authority and the forces of an expanding global order, leaving lessons in resilience, adaptation, and the costs of structural change that remain relevant today. Ultimately, the story of the Ashanti's decline after the abolition of the slave trade reminds us that power is both fragile and contingent, tied not only to internal organization and cultural strength, but also to the broader currents of international politics and commerce. The empire's military prowess. Political sophistication and economic innovation could delay decline, but global shifts in morality, trade, and imperial ambition reshaped the landscape irrevocably. Reflecting on this period, we see the importance of adaptability, strategic foresight, and the recognition that even the most powerful states must navigate external forces with care if they hope to endure, leaving a historical legacy that continues to illuminate the complexities of power, resistance, and survival in West Africa and beyond. As we reflect on the sweeping history of the Ashanti Empire, it becomes clear that their story is one of remarkable complexity, illustrating both the heights of human ingenuity and the profound costs of ambition. The Ashanti's role in the transatlantic slave trade was central to their rise, enabling them to generate extraordinary wealth, build a disciplined and highly organized military, and develop a sophisticated political and social system that, in many, was ahead of its time. Their leaders, from Moses II onward, demonstrated strategic brilliance, uniting fragmented Akan states, consolidating power, and navigating the turbulent waters of European trade and diplomacy with skill and foresight. The empire's military prowess, economic acumen, and cultural cohesion created a society that could command respect from neighboring kingdoms and European traders alike, leaving a legacy of strength and innovation that continues to inspire admiration today. Yet, alongside this impressive development, there lies a shadow that cannot be ignored: the Ashanti's active participation in the slave trade, capturing and selling captives from neighboring communities and engaging with European powers to facilitate the transatlantic transport of millions of Africans, contributed to untold suffering and disruption. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and cultural continuities fractured. The diaspora that emerged from these centuries of forced migration extended across the Americas and the Caribbean, spreading African peoples, traditions, and resilience, but also embedding a legacy of trauma, exploitation, and loss that reverberates across generations. Understanding the Ashanti Empire, therefore, requires a dual lens, one that appreciates the sophistication and achievements of their civilization, and another that reckons honestly with the human cost of their economic and military strategies. This juxtaposition of accomplishment and tragedy offers a powerful lens for examining history more broadly. It reminds us that prosperity built on the suffering of others, no matter how organized or efficient, carries consequences that extend far beyond immediate gains. The Ashanti's wealth, while contributing to their empire's endurance and regional influence, was inseparable from the displacement, labor exploitation, and social disruption of countless lives. Even today, descendants of West African communities can trace cultural and familial fractures back to these events, while the global African diaspora reflects a complex tapestry of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring struggle to preserve identity in the aftermath of forced migration. These outcomes underscore the profound ways in which economic ambition and political strategy can intersect with ethical considerations, leaving legacies that are both tangible and deeply human. Moreover, the Ashanti example illuminates the interconnectedness of local and global histories. The empire did not exist in isolation. Its fortunes were tied to European demand, transatlantic commerce, and broader geopolitical currents that spanned continents. Their success and eventual decline demonstrate how local agency and global forces continuously interact, shaping societies in ways that are often unpredictable and far-reaching. While the Ashanti navigated these dynamics with skill, they also faced the limitations imposed by external pressures, from European abolitionist movements to colonial expansion, showing that even the most organized and resilient societies are vulnerable to shifts in the broader world around them. In reflecting on the Ashanti Empire's story, we also see the value of remembering history in its full complexity. It is tempting to celebrate only the military victories, the architectural achievements, and the administrative sophistication, or conversely, to focus solely on the suffering caused by the slave trade. Yet, the most meaningful understanding comes from holding both truths together, acknowledging the brilliance and the brutality, the resilience and the disruption, and the lessons embedded in each. This balanced perspective allows us to honor the ingenuity and courage of past societies while also learning from their moral and ethical choices. Understanding the consequences of power when exercised without regard for human dignity, and recognizing the enduring impacts of historical actions on contemporary life. For modern audiences, the Ashanti Empire's history invites reflection on leadership, strategy, and the ethics of economic and political decisions. It encourages us to consider how wealth and power can be pursued responsibly, how societies can build resilience without exploiting others, and how cultural cohesion and governance can thrive alongside compassion and justice. By studying the Ashanti, we gain not only knowledge of a pivotal West African civilization but also insight into the broader, human challenges of ambition, morality, and the long-term consequences of our actions. Their story resonates across time and place, offering lessons that are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. As we close this exploration of the Ashanti Empire and their complex legacy, we want to thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Your curiosity, attention, and engagement make these stories alive and meaningful, connecting us across time and space to the people, societies, and events that shape the world we live in. If you found this video insightful, we invite you to click like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into forgotten and fascinating chapters of history. By doing, you help support the continuation of well-researched, engaging historical storytelling that honors the past while informing the present. As we part for now, we encourage you to reflect on the lessons of the Ashanti, the brilliance of their achievements, the complexities of their choices, and the enduring human consequences of their actions. Let their story remind us that history is never simple, that every civilization carries triumphs and tragedies, and that understanding the past is essential to navigating our future with awareness, empathy, and insight. Thank you once again for watching, and we wish you a peaceful night filled with rest and reflection.